Okay, let's start. As I was saying, tonight's Promethean Action class is on the Strategic Defense Initiative of Lyndon LaRouche and Ronald Reagan, which was appropriately a major subject of the just released Ronald Reagan movie. We're going to discuss the Strategic Defense Initiative of Ronald Reagan and LaRouche, who was the actual author of the policy, as contrasted with the nuclear war policy of candidate Kamala Harris, who was exposed on this score by President Trump at the end of their debate. So let me put up a chronology. And this really covers most of what I'm going to be talking about. As you see, it says in 1913, H.G. Wells wrote The World Set Free. 1933, The Shape of Things to Come. 1939, Bertrand Russell Envoy Szilard drafts Einstein's secret letter to Roosevelt, which triggered the Manhattan Project, and then subsequent developments we'll get into. So British nuclear weapons policy long precedes the existence of nuclear weapons. The British Empire chief intelligence operative and well known, as of course, as a science fiction writer, H.G. Wells, was one of the first to anticipate nuclear weapons. In 1913, more than 20 years before, more than 30 years before nuclear weapons were actually possible. He was aware of the researches of Rutherford and a co-worker, Frederick Soddy, who was very well known, not so well known today, although he should be, who had explained the chain reaction decay of radioactive elements, beginning with radium. And the fact that the sample radium, at let's say, gave off a small amount of energy at any given time. But if you accumulated the energy that radium was giving off during its lifetime, it was an enormous, but hitherto unheard of, ratio of energy to mass. That's what Wells learned from Soddy, and he dedicated his 1913 book, The World Set Free, to Frederick Soddy's 1909 book on radium. So as I said, the nuclear weapon, which Wells foresaw, was not he explains this in detail in the book, it was not a sudden, all-at-once explosion of like an atomic bomb, but it's sort of like radium only speeded up. It was an explosion which took place over days and months, like a volcano. It's just an eerie premonition he had. So the book begins in 1933 with the invention, of atomic energy, as imagined by Wells, and proceeds into a war which resembles the First World War, only fought with these horrible nuclear weapons, which create, as it were, perpetual live volcanoes, fountains of fire, lava, molten everything, with obviously unbelievable carnage. In the first bombardment of Holland by Germany, 1 million people are killed in a single bombardment. And within a few years, every major city in the world is a flaming volcano or a bunch of flaming volcanoes with millions dead all over the world. I mean, the only image I can think of is Hieronymus Bosch's hell. This is what the world has become under this nuclear war forecast decades in advance by H.G. Wells. So most of the world's capitals are burning, millions are dead, government is ended over large areas of the world. In every thickly populated area, the population is starving or on the edge of it because of the wipeout of agriculture and logistics. Humanity is compared by Wells through another fictional writer writing this thing. Humanity is compared to a sleeper who handles matches in his sleep and wakes to find himself in flames. So the plot revolves. So in Wells's view of it, the problem is nations, national languages, the national distinctions, and government. And the hero of the novel, who's the French ambassador in Washington, whose name is Leblanc, Leblanc, realizes that war must end, and the only way to end war was to have but one government for mankind. So this is his sudden revelation. He goes to the President of the United States, whom he convinces, and he calls a convocation of world leaders and influentials in a Swiss town called Brissago. Britain's King Egbert arrives on foot, a very self-abnegating king, abdicates in order to help form the world government. And the committee of various kings, prime ministers, notables, scientists, and journalists in Brissago proclaims the World Republic. And King Egbert, or the former King Egbert, just abdicated of England, tells the assembly, now we have to get every atom of carolinum and all the plants to make it into our control. I should have said that the substance of these strange atomic weapons, which just go on as a perpetual blast and fire, they're made of carolinum, of course, an element which doesn't exist. We have to get every atom of carolinum throughout the planet and every plant to make it into our own hands. So various rebellions around the world by people trying to reassert nations and national sovereignty are put down. A rebellion in Japan is put down by sword, if I understand it correctly. A major rebellion is mounted by Ferdinand Charles, the Fox King of the Balkans, who tries to assemble some carolinum and some airplanes to go up and blow up Brissago, but his planes are shot down and he himself is killed by an inspection party. I mean, part of the thing, which is familiar to you from more recent history, I think, is that the World Republic in Brissago has a total right of inspection of anything on no notice throughout the world, armed inspection. So in an armed inspection in the Balkans, they kill the king's team and confiscate his carolinum. So, I mean, just to summarize how Wells sees the whole thing in his own words, he says, the old tendencies of man's nature, suspicion, jealousy, particularism, and belligerency, were incompatible with the monstrous destructive powers of the new appliances the inhuman logic of science had produced. Science has outrun man's form of organization into nations, and man's form of organization must now become this, what to Wells is the scientific form of organization, which is a one world dictatorship. He doesn't call it that here, but he does elsewhere. A one world dictatorship, one world government, aka empire, although he steers clear of that word. Now in in 1933, Wells wrote The Shape of Things to Come, a much more elaborate and very lengthy scenario of the same kind of thing. The Shape of Things to Come is an imaginary history of the world from, I think, roughly the date of writing, 1913, well into the present century. And what he projects is that the Second World War, which was to come as soon as, when he wrote it in 1933, the Second World War was fought between economically collapsing countries. There were no victors. There was total exhaustion, helped by atomic bombs, much more like the present atomic bombs. There was collapse and disintegration in most countries. Most governments broke down. In 1957-58, or rather 56-57, a devastating plague broke out and killed off much of humanity. So in this desperate circumstance, with much of the world reduced to medieval conditions, pilots and technical organizations of air transport and air travel around the world organized themselves into what became called the dictatorship of the air. And Wells also calls it the modern state. The modern state is the world empire, or he doesn't call it empire, the world government, world dictatorship, which abolishes national divisions, abolishes national languages, and outlaws religion, as I'll describe more particularly in a moment. Under the dictatorship of the air, the world empire, if you like, or becomes a classless society, not in the communist sense of everybody becoming proletarians, but because the entire world population becomes middle-class intellectuals, like H.G. Wells. Now, as I said, I mean, it's not a major part of the book, very lengthy book, but a major task of the dictatorship of the air, in addition to suppressing all national governments, is to abolish all religions. Religion is actually outlawed in this future dictatorship. So he describes how Islam is eradicated. It doesn't just say much about Protestantism, or he does discuss Judaism. But the toughest opposition in Wells's novel is the Catholic Church. So the beginning of putting them down is when the Pope and the whole Italian hierarchy is lured out to bless airplanes being inaugurated in Italy. And they're all struck with Pacificum, not to be confused with Carolinum, which is a gas which the world dictators have discovered, which puts you out for 36 hours. presumably with no bad effects. So when they wake up, the church is gone in Italy, but it finds refuge in Ireland. And there's a huge, now this is so reminiscent of the British Empire in past history. There's a huge struggle to suppress Ireland and the Catholic Church, which is the established church in Ireland, becomes that in Wales. And when the church is finally subdued in Ireland, it rises again in Latin America under a colored pope in Pernambuco. And this too is repressed. Um, the uh, the I mean, there's world education is a major part of the book, a huge part of the book, and the it's instilling everybody in the world with loyalty to the universal world state, where there must be no particular loyalties. All languages are abolished in favor of basic English. I don't know if people know what basic English is. Basic English is English with a lot of the words removed. You're not allowed to use them anymore. It's very reminiscent of Newspeak in George Orwell's 1984, where they said, dissent is impossible in INGSOC now in 1984 because all the words which dissenters would use have been eliminated from the language. So basic English, which is an invention by Bertrand Russell and various other evil people, and it's going to be imposed on the world by Wells, is sort of like English, but with many of the best words removed. In Wells' book, the people who speak normal English are tolerated for a while, but eventually they'll have to purge their vocabulary and go back to basic English. The now the now the next step. So this is an elaborate, and there's more to it, but this is an elaborated design by Wells, which is the British nuclear weapons policy. It's the use of nuclear weapons to destroy the nation state and introduce world government, world dictatorship, or a worldwide British empire, if you like. I mean, Lyndon LaRouche said that in writing about NATO, this may be a paper that Barbara will be referring to, but in writing about the British role in NATO in the 1990s, he said Charles de Gaulle recognized that London's intent was Russell's, that is Lord Bertrand Russell, who we'll get to in a minute, Russell's repeatedly stated nuclear weapons policy to exploit the East-West nuclear powers conflict to subvert the institutions of the modern nation state. And this is precisely British policy to a T. And and it's what I've described in Wells. Now, in 1933, a number of things happened. The neutron was discovered. Nuclear fission was discovered. And the Hungarian emigre scientist who was a buddy and sort of servant of Bertrand Russell, Leo Szilard, read Wells' 1913 novel, The World Set Free. So Szilard got a patent. He had conceptualized the nuclear chain reaction of uranium-235. And not that he was the only one to do so, or even the first, but he, as far as he knew, he was the first. He conceptualized it. He took a patent on it, which he which he arranged to remain secret. And he contacted Albert Einstein in the US to write to President Roosevelt, basically to begin the Manhattan Project. I mean, it's the Einstein 1933 letter to Roosevelt. And you can find it's about a 3-page letter. Of course, it was secret for years after. But he noted that there was indications that uranium could be used to induce a powerful explosion, something bigger than anything hitherto heard of. He noted where world reserves of uranium were and said that the United States should begin to get a hold of reserves of uranium where possible and begin to study these questions, which Roosevelt did immediately. It was the beginning, it was, ultimately the beginning of the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. So, I mean, this was the Russell Circle ensuring, and probably would have happened anyway, but it was the Russell Circle ensuring that the atomic weapon, which they had forecasts for so long and relied on for so long in order to force through world government, through the Einstein letter to Roosevelt, Russell ensured that this atomic weapon was in fact built. Now, of course, it was not only built, but it was used. It was used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Unfortunately, fewer World War II veterans are with us now. Many of them were convinced by intensive propaganda in the military that the atomic weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki saved literally millions of lives, which would have been spent in infantry battling through the main islands of Japan. And indeed, I mean, if infantry had battled the Japanese through the main islands, millions would have died. There's no question about that. But what they don't know is that there was no way that was going to happen. Japan had already been defeated. The Japanese knew this. They couldn't defend the islands. The American bombing raids met very little resistance. They couldn't move on the sea under MacArthur's blockade. They were defeated and they were suing for peace. And they were probably doing it through many channels, but one which has come very much to light and which Lyndon LaRouche was totally aware of during his life because he knew some of the people involved, was the Japanese were negotiating through Monsignor Montini of the Vatican, later Pope Paul VI, who was the Vatican ambassador for extraordinary affairs. And that he was negotiating, the Japanese were negotiating through Montini, and Montini was talking to Roosevelt through the OSS. Now, so there was absolutely no reason to drop the bomb. The Japanese condition to Montini and the Americans was the same condition it was all the time. And really, they presented it in private, but it was really well known. The condition was that Japan be allowed to maintain the imperial system and that the emperor not be tried as a war criminal. And these were exactly the conditions which MacArthur granted. And in fact, many people many American officials wanted Truman to publicly announce that the U.S. agreed to that, even outside of negotiations, so as to have peace. But in spite of this, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was pushed through by the British because it had always been part of their scheme that nuclear weapons should be used so that they could use them in their scheme for world government. So Churchill, who had tremendous influence on Truman, got to him on this, as did the Secretary of War. And these two men convinced Truman to drop the bombs needlessly, sacrificing 100,000 lives on the spot to civilians, women and children, for nothing. The entirety of the U.S. military command disagreed. MacArthur, Eisenhower, to begin with Admiral Leahy, who was the highest ranking officer in the U.S. military, General Marshall, this wasn't known at the time, but more recently, about 10 years ago, it's come to light that Marshall, behind the scenes, was trying to prevent this. MacArthur and Eisenhower were against it. Admiral King, Admiral Halsey, the Admiral Hap Arnold, the head of the Air Force, the entire military command opposed it appropriately as militarily unnecessary. And as Eisenhower said afterwards, it shouldn't be our country which first used this terrible weapon, least of all upon civilians. And nevertheless, it was done. It was done by British influence for the purpose of the British scheme, which I've been describing. Now, Bertrand Russell, the top, unlike Wells, Wells was a hireling, a brilliant man in his way, but Wells was a hireling of the British oligarchy. Russell was a British oligarch, the grandson of the Prime Minister Lord John Russell, who sponsored the Confederacy against us in the 19th century. In 1946, in October 1946, Russell wrote he wrote an article, which he had a terribly hard time getting published. Nobody wanted to publish it, for good reason. But the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist published it under the title, The Atomic Bomb and the Prevention of War. And Russell said, in that short article, you can read it on the web, he said, great wars can only be prevented by the establishment of an international government with a monopoly of serious armed forces. One that really governs, not an amiable facade like the League of Nations or a pretentious sham like the United Nations under its present constitution. This world government must have the only atomic bomb, the only ability to produce atom bombs, the only air force, the only battleships, and in sum, whatever is needed to make it irresistible. He said this world government must be composed of men of many different nations. There must be no possibility of the development of national feeling in any unit larger than a company. Every member of the international armed force should be carefully trained in loyalty to the international government. A monopoly of uranium, a large army of inspectors with the right to enter any factory without notice, any attempt to interfere with them is casus belli, a reason for war. This world government will decide all disputes between nations, and it will have the right to revise all international treaties. This world government, will be constitutionally bound to attack any nation that refuses to submit to its arbitration. So this was Russell's scheme for the world government. Now, the development of this British world government notion became mutually assured destruction. that the guarantee of peace between the superpowers, the US and the Soviets, was that they would each be able to annihilate the other, and that neither would have any way to defend itself against such annihilation, therefore mutually assured destruction. If they go to nuclear war, the destruction of both is assured. Now, how do you assure it? Well, I mean, just for an interlude, I could cite the Leo Szilard's story or paper, Mined Cities, M-I-N-E-D Cities, 1966, in which a visitor comes in a strange way, which I won't describe. A visitor comes to Denver, Colorado, and his host says to him, well, you can get $3,000 a month, if I remember the amount, from the government here just for living here because it's a mined city. So the visitor says, well, what's a mined city? His host said, oh, well, you don't know, you've been out of things, but there's a number of American cities with 20 million population combined, and a number of Russian cities with 20 million population combined. And each is mined with hydrogen bombs placed under the cities. And the men who man these mines are prepared to blow them up on order. Is mutually assured destruction in order to ensure this peace. So, I mean, Szilard gives a lot more details, but that's basically the scheme. It's obviously clinically insane, but equally clinically insane is the whole scheme of mutually assured destruction, which was the British plan was represented by British agent Henry Kissinger, who said he got his orders from the famous speech at Chatham House. He said he got his orders from the British Foreign Office, who introduced this as a treaty in 1972, the start with the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty that made it unlawful to defend the United States against thermonuclear weapons, except for one single site with the limited number of interceptors. It was unlawful except for a small defense of one small area of the country. Same was true in Russia. So this was the balance of nuclear terror, or the nuclear revenge weapons, which Ronald Reagan said, to LaRouche, and I know Barbara will go through this, which Ronald Reagan said to LaRouche and to many others. He said, I cannot stomach revenge weapons. The only use of these thermonuclear weapons is to impotently revenge ourselves on the Soviets in a situation where both countries will inevitably be destroyed. So I think that's basically what I wanted to say. I mean, there is a British nuclear weapons policy. It's very old, it long precedes nuclear weapons, and it's active today in the Ukraine crisis as we sit here, where the British are, supposedly asking permission to allow the Ukrainians to use their Storm Shadow missiles with British targeting, with direct involvement of British personnel, to target sites deep within Russia, inviting Russian retaliation. So let me pass it over to Barbara.
So, what Tony made clear is the policy behind the Strategic Defense Initiative, the SDI, can lead to a very different international environment, one in which sovereign nation states, what the British sought to destroy through world government, seek to define a community of principle based on raising the living standards of all nations on the earth to levels befitting human beings, while jointly exploring space and the universe to discover the principles of life and God's universe itself. That's what LaRouche saw as the opportunity of the Strategic Defense Initiative, breaking out of this type of straitjacket. And indeed, what we'll get to is what he proposed to the Soviets, and what Reagan also proposed to the Soviets, is that the United States and the Soviet Union together actually develop strategic defense. Now, that in turn exploits the nuclear and electromagnetic domains for peaceful purposes. That opens up the potential of fusion energy production, nuclear-propelled space exploration, hugely significant revolutions in industrial and manufacturing processes, and the ability to visualize the dynamics of life itself and cell biology in fundamentally new ways. It also creates the basis, once again, for nation states based on differing cultures to find common ground in creating a future worthy, as Edward Teller once noted, of the common aims of mankind. It's the very opposite of the British imperial model, which is designed essentially to be the enforcement mechanism of a rentier-financed world government, which has to engage in wars of conquest in order to secure the raw materials it needs for continued existence, which also needs to reduce the population growth down to the bare minimum its predatory organization of economies can sustain. The world government Tony was talking about is really nothing other than a new version, a modern version of the Roman Empire. So I'm going to talk about the SDI tonight, probably in terms many people have never heard before. Many of you may be familiar with Ronald Reagan's firm adherence to this idea of destroying nuclear warheads as they are launched and before they can destroy this world, from the film which was recently released called Reagan. What you probably don't know about is the backstory concerning the fight for the SDI and the reasons why it was sabotage, which Tony has elaborated. Donald Trump has declared that he wants to build this missile shield for the United States. He has said repeatedly that the policies of Joe Biden and our arms industries are leading us to all-out nuclear war with Russia. That event seems ever more perilously close with this week's news about the British seeking to use long-range missiles to strike Russia, and Putin's response that this would mean that Russia is at war with NATO. Russia has recently developed hypersonic missiles well ahead of the United States, and the uses of drone swarms to potentially deliver lethal weapons now being developed on the battlefields of Ukraine will defeat any current kinetic-based missile defense systems. So there's a sense in which the need for the SDI could not be more profound just for basic defense in current circumstances. I'm not going to talk tonight about all the technical features of a layered beam defense system or microwave or laser defense and what the progress has been since Ronald Reagan's announcement. The overall progress appears to be classified, although there's a wealth of open source material detailing programs in lasers, in the supercomputing necessary to track missiles, and satellite technologies, in confinement-based fusion technology, and nuclear-based rockets, in microwave and other technologies. Many of the same scientific barriers and technologies must be conquered in the dedicated race to colonize the moon and to go to Mars, as President Trump has specified in his Artemis program. President Trump seems to be saying now that this perfection of this technology is within reach. I'm also adding the caveat that what we're saying then about Soviet intentions and programs is not true about Russia and also about China, although the intentions of the globalist proponents of the mad military doctrine remain the same: to destroy nation states, as Tony outlined, in order to institute world government. So in describing the fight waged for the SDI in the first instance and the resulting collapse of the Soviet Union, which Reagan's policy definitely caused, as Lyndon LaRouche predicted, that fight is very instructive both in terms of economics and in terms of politics and statecraft. Understanding it properly could result in the full beneficial use of this technology as stipulated by Lyndon LaRouche and initiated by Ronald Reagan. We need to review that so that what Trump is proposing is not sabotaged again. And we'll talk about other aspects of the SDI in a future class. First, for those approaching this subject for the first time, here's Ronald Reagan's announcement on March 23rd, 1983. Tony, could you play that?
Will do.
On March 23, 1983, in a televised address to the nation, President Ronald Reagan announced his intention to embark upon groundbreaking research into a national defense system that could make nuclear weapons obsolete. It was called the Strategic Defense Initiative. The heart of the program was a plan to develop a space-based missile defense program that could protect the country from a large-scale nuclear attack. 41 years ago this week, while delivering an address to the nation on defense and national security, President Reagan said,
"I'm taking an important first step. I am directing a comprehensive and intensive effort to define a long-term research and development program to begin to achieve our ultimate goal of eliminating the threat posed by strategic nuclear missiles. This could pave the way for arms control measures to eliminate the weapons themselves. We seek neither military superiority nor political advantage. Our only purpose, one all people share, is to search for ways to reduce the danger of nuclear war."
On March 23, 1983, in a televised address to the nation.
Now, that announcement has a very interesting history. In 1977, Major General George Keegan gave a public speech and wrote articles in which he warned that the Soviet Union was developing a nuclear-based particle beam weapon system to destroy incoming nuclear missiles at the same time as they were developing a significant civil defense capacity in order to survive a nuclear attack and perhaps to be able to initiate a first strike. Their aim was to win a nuclear war, Keegan said, as opposed to the policy of MAD. Keegan was the head of Air Force intelligence at the time and based his claims on satellite and other electronic monitoring of Soviet sites and conversations. The arms control mafia in the CIA and the Pentagon and the State Department, which Tony described, went wild and attacked Keegan. After all, they thought they had succeeded in killing the idea of missile defense once and for all with the 1972 ABM treaty, which Tony described. That treaty, however, left open the possibility of research into potential ABM systems based on newly discovered physical principles, precisely the program Keegan was describing and saying the Soviets were doing. Lyndon LaRouche and his scientific team, working out of the Fusion Energy Foundation, immediately recognized that Keegan's claims rang entirely true, given their knowledge of Soviet scientific capacities and the dedication of Soviet scientists to Riemannian and other forms of advanced physics. They began contacting scientists and engineers in the United States and military figures throughout Western Europe, including in Italy, France, and Germany, to test the veracity of Keegan's claims. And these scientists and military figures vouched for Keegan. They said he was right. LaRouche was a student of Soviet Marshal Sokolovsky's military strategy. He had studied it. And he said anybody else who studied that would know that the Soviets had made survival of a nuclear attack based on defenses centered on relativistic physics principles, such as lasers, destroying incoming missiles. And that was a central aspect of their military doctrine from 1962 forward. Further, the Soviets had created the scientific and engineering cadre capable of creating just such a capacity. As General Keegan emphasized, perfection of this technology would open a new era in both civilian and military technologies, an invention on the level of the atomic bomb. Based on their initial contacts and researches, a pamphlet was produced by LaRouche's team. It was called Beam Weapons, Sputnik of the 1970s, and widely distributed throughout the United States. LaRouche noted that these defensive weapons were not only defensive weapons of warfare, that the technological spin-offs of a crash program to perfect them would result, and I quote, in greater leaps in the productive power of labor than was accomplished by the development of heat-powered machines, by chemistry, by the use of electricity, that their primary impact would not be military, but rather economic and cultural. And that was the heart of his presentation. In 1981 and 1982, LaRouche and his associates had extensive contacts with the Reagan National Security Council and with Bobby Ray Inman, then Deputy Director of the CIA, concerning the topic of missile defense. In December of 1981, the administration requested that LaRouche personally meet with Soviet representatives in a classified special compartmentalized back-channel negotiation to determine how the Soviets would react if the United States adopted a strategic defense policy based on new physical principles. In February of 1982, LaRouche had presented his proposals for a crash program to develop these defenses at a conference in Washington, widely attended by both administration officials and by Soviet representatives. And LaRouche's back-channel discussions with a Soviet representative commenced shortly thereafter under the auspices of the National Security Council. At the same time, Edward Teller, a close friend of Reagan and the inventor of the hydrogen bomb and the leader of Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, took up his own cudgels on behalf of perfecting beam weapons. Scientists from Lawrence Livermore were active collaborators with the Fusion Energy Foundation, and some of them became members of the Fusion Energy Foundation. LaRouche's discussions with the Soviets continued up to February of 1983. But in the interim, Henry Kissinger and others, at the specific request of the British government, demanded that the FBI initiate a national security investigation of LaRouche based on the idea that he was a Soviet disinformation asset, similar to their assessment and attacks on Donald Trump. It should be noted here that all along, Reagan's proposal, as advocated by LaRouche, was that the United States and the Soviet Union would share the development of this technology, that it was not intended to set off an arms race, but it opened up the new possibilities inherent in the scientific and technological breakthrough on behalf of all of mankind. In February of 1983, the Soviets terminated these discussions in what might be described as their worst decision of their entire reign. They said they would reject the offer of joint deployment because the superior scientific and productivity capabilities of the West would be used to disadvantage and defeat them. LaRouche warned them at that time that the US would adopt this program in any event, and that trying to meet the fact that the US was developing this with an offensive nuclear and conventional arms buildup on the Soviet side would destroy the Soviet economy within 5 years. And that is indeed what happened. At that meeting, the Soviets further informed LaRouche that they had been assured by the Democratic Party's leadership that the SDI would not be adopted by the Reagan administration or developed. And indeed, the Democratic Party began an active campaign to build up the freeze movement in the United States and to also sabotage and go after Reagan's SDI and everybody associated with it. In the history of the SDI, it is widely admitted that Reagan's speech was the subject of intense maneuvering and sabotage internally within the administration. James Baker, the Bush operative who was Reagan's chief of staff, saw Reagan's draft of the speech and completely excised the SDI announcement. Judge William Clark from the NSC group working with LaRouche and Edward Teller saw Baker's sabotage and put the announcement back in. In almost every account, administration officials say they were shocked and flabbergasted by Reagan's totally unanticipated announcement. Core groups of scientists working in these areas were pulled together by the traitors and informed that the SDI would never happen, that the only person in the administration who truly believed in it was Ronald Reagan, although Cap Weinberger was an advocate at the Pentagon. A contrary kinetic weapons program led by General Danny Graham and supported by George H.W. Bush and the Heritage Foundation was floated and received funding and massive political support. LaRouche's proposal that this be a crash program, like the Apollo space program, was abandoned, with the SDI just given enough funding to keep going at the national laboratories, particularly at Los Alamos and Livermore. Much of the history of the SDI that you find these days comes straight from the historical revisionism of the entire battle written by George Shultz, the Satanic Secretary of State under Reagan, who played a big role in all of its sabotage. At the Reagan Library itself, this grand initiative on behalf of all mankind has been coupled with the movie remains of the Star Wars series in what can only be described as one of the greatest historical blasphemies. Throughout the SDI battle, LaRouche described it as primarily a battle about culture and economics and not about the weapon system per se. All the technical advances in perfecting these technologies he attributed to Edward Teller and his team at Lawrence Livermore. He notes in a very interesting paper the difference between LaRouche and Teller's role in creating the SDI, that it was this aspect of the president's proposals which caused the Soviets to rage against LaRouche. They undertook a campaign of defamation throughout the world and demanded repeatedly that LaRouche be prosecuted, which the United States Department of Justice indeed did, while accepting that Teller was acting as a disinterested scientist. The scientific and technological revolution embodied in the SDI would have ended the post-industrial collapse of the United States, which the Soviets were perfectly happy with. At the same time, LaRouche's analysis of the Soviet economy indicated that it would not have the capacity to beat the United States in a crash program development of the SDI. That was because the United States still had the remnants of the skilled labor force and spirit of technological optimism, which had characterized the mobilization of industry and logistics in depth, which won World War II. While the Soviets had a superior scientific cadre, the bureaucratic and backward political organization of its citizenry blocked the ability to rapidly assimilate new technologies and produce them at scale. That problem was rapidly emerging in the United States back then. That is why the LaRouche's associates turned to Japan and held conferences there based on Japan's adoption of superior productive methods and innovative productive technologies in an attempt to produce the SDI. Like Trump, LaRouche proposed addressing our present economic crisis by an economic mobilization approaching the World War II mobilization and economic recovery of 1939 to 43. That creates economic and political stability and fosters the cultural optimism necessary for creative human reason to function. He wrote, "Under those conditions," and I quote, "we postponed the danger of warfare long enough for the superpowers to complete deployment of strategic ABM systems, assuming joint development." Quote, "This also unleashes the greatest technological revolution in history." as technologies such as high-powered lasers, including X-ray and gamma-ray lasers, and laser-like particle beams, enable some workmen during this century to mass-produce transmutations of matter at his or her workbench, so to speak. So I will leave my briefing at that. I note that Dennis Quaid is saying, like George Shultz's analysis, that the SDI was a grand strategic bluff, that essentially we bluffed the Soviets into destroying themselves. Nothing could be further from the truth, and millions have died as a result of the small wars being conducted on behalf of empire in the interim, rather than achieving the solution which Donald Trump now proposes we undertake. So I'll leave my presentation at that.
Terrific.